Welcome to Sex in the News. We are the Siegel brothers. We have an interesting collection of stories for you tonight. First, we'll be looking at the artists behind the new Superman comic reportedly requiring LAPD protection. A rather grisly pair of stories. One about a mom being arrested after bringing a knife to a police station, hoping to stab the man who raped her daughter's corpse. And related to that, said Necrophiliac was arrested after admitting to sexually abusing almost 100 corpses in the hospital mortuary over a 12-year period. And as seems to be a kind of recurring theme on Sex in the News, we'll be talking about some corporations funding Ohio's proposed abortion ban, making Texas look like easy.
Yeah, making Texas look like a liberal state. All right, so our first one.
Hey, welcome back, my brother.
Welcome back to you as well, and thank you for joining us on our Sunday edition of Sex in the News.
Yeah. So I'm sure it's not breaking news here. I'm sure most people have heard in the news about the controversy behind the new Superman character being created as a bisexual superhero. And sure enough, in this great country of ours, this has resulted in the artists who are making this new Superman comic receiving death threats and having to have police dispatched to patrol their homes as people were, according to TMZ, inundating the studio to complain about the announcement and make threats, requesting patrols for their staff.
And we know Marvel has been updating their universe to kind of keep up with the times, which is really something that all comics have done. Right?
Sure.
Comic books have done that from the very beginning. Remember, Superman was sort of like an anti-communist, anti-Nazi kind
Wonder
of
Woman
thing.
too. There was a lot of politics in there.
That's right. So comic books have always, and superheroes in particular, have always really reflected the times that they exist in. So now when we look at, how we've been embracing more sexual diversity, it's a natural progression to see some of these kinds of social issues appearing in the comic book superhero world.
Right.
But when it comes to Superman kissing another man, being bisexual. And it's not Superman, by the way. Right? Just to keep it updated, it's his son. Right? Isn't this version Superman's son? So it's not Clark Kent Superman, it's the next generation. Right? What I find most interesting about that too, and I don't remember the name of it, but there's another kind of new generation superhero type of show.
Superman, son of Kal-El?
Kal-El.
Sorry,
right?
I'm rusty.
So there's some of the more contemporary, new generation, I think Marvel superheroes, where there are basically bisexual women, right? And there's scenes where they're not only kissing each other, but they're obviously being sexual with each other. And I haven't heard any complaints about that.
Well, it's like we talked about a long time ago, the difference between the seemingly obligatory chick scene in porn that's made for a male gaze and what lesbian porn looks like.
Yep.
And they don't look the same.
No, they don't.
In any way. They generally do not look the same.
Right.
Because, it goes back to that, who's the guy that did the research for on the MTV videos back in the 80s?
Soot Jolly.
Right. Again, the idea of the male gaze and the fantasy in music videos, which remember still in the 21st century are still commercials to buy or download the music being produced there.
We stream now.
Yeah, but it's still all about
That's right.
So people are downloading and paying with Bitcoin instead of sending a check in the mail with a stamp on the envelope. But that fantasy that women are just such constantly simmering pots of passion and they just spend their whole life trying to keep the lid down, but if they get upset, it's going to boil over, and they're always so horny and desperate.
Just waiting for a man.
Right, but if there's no man around, they'll turn to each other, and then the man will show up and it'll turn into that fantasy threesome.
Right.
When in fact, if they're really lesbians and a guy shows up, they'll be like,
get out of here.
Get out, get out of here, right?
That's right.
So,
That's right.
Yeah, it's an interesting sign of the times.
I was going to say another double standard, but it's the same double standard.
Right, yeah. And it's just, not to go off on a tangent, but this trend in this country that if anybody says anything that pisses off this certain segment of the country, this loud, radical, fanatical, radicalized right-wing fringe, immediately starts with the death threats.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
That people who volunteer to work at a poll and check people in and hand them a blank ballot have to get death threats. It's insanity.
Well, yes, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. And that segment of the population, I do believe, is certifiably insane. Right? And now, having said that, please don't send me death threats.
Right, there you go. You just put a target on your back.
I just really don't want that. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, change the fucking channel.
Yeah.
Right? What happened to that? Instead of...
there you go. Change the channel. Turn the page,
right.
Look away.
Howard Stern.
Don't prevent other people from enjoying.
Howard Stern's probably a good historical marker, because if anybody remembers from Private Parts, they talked about how when he first went on NBC in New York, and all the producers hated him and were looking for excuses to get rid of him until they saw the ratings, that he was killing everybody, and they found that the average fan listened. This was unprecedented at that time because drive time radio, people listened like an average of 10 or 15 minutes. And they were listening to Howard Stern an average of 30 minutes. And all these producers are like, how could this be? How could this be? How about all these people that call up saying they hate him? They were listening for 45 minutes. Right? Just to be outraged.
For the same reason.
Yeah.
That they liked him and they disliked him.
They wanted to hear what he was going to say next. But I think that was the beginning of this thirst for this quest for being outraged. I'm going to find somebody to piss me off so I can just go off and start boycotting and threatening their lives.
But we also can't underestimate the power that the internet has given that, and the anonymity that comes along with that.
Bravery that comes from hiding behind a screen.
And again, well, with some of these, right-wing people, they will say this to your face. But most of those people will say all these things online in an anonymous forum where they don't have to be identified that they would never, ever have the guts to say to anybody's face.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of the problem too, that it creates this sort of empowerment of cowards.
Right.
Ultimately.
Right.
Right. So on to our next story.
Yeah, well, this is kind of
stories.
Yeah, these certainly go together.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and a little grisly.
News is not always pretty.
Right, and this is absolutely the definition of not pretty news. As I read in the intro, a mom was arrested because she found out about this necrophiliac who was arrested, and when word got out that he abused almost 100 corpses working late night shifts in hospital mortuaries.
Yep.
When he was jailed for double homicide, and this woman found out that she sadly lost a daughter, and that her daughter's corpse was apparently one of the hundreds. Apparently this rather twisted individual kept journals and written logs.
Yeah, we had a conversation the other day that was even kind of, I would say,
like,
ironic.
Which is creepier?
Yeah.
Right? The acts he committed or the fact that he kept such diligent records.
Weren't
and-
there millions
Yes,
of videos
14,
and journal entries?
More than 14 million images were uncovered by detectives, unveiling countless horrors, including child pornography and footage of his sexually assaulting dead bodies. I mean, he recorded himself
Yep.
in the act.
And
So-
let's name this guy. We can, this is
Yes.
a guy named David Fuller.
This was in Great Britain.
In Great Britain, 67 years old, who also admitted to sexually abusing the corpses of women and 3 children. And he did this over 12 years.
2 murders thrown in there for
right.
good measure.
Right.
This,
And like I said, it was almost 100 corpses.
yeah.
And this guy was, writing about it. There are journals he kept. There are photographs that he took, and all these
And
other
again, he
images.
recorded himself in the act. So
Again, where does the sick end with this kind of stuff?
right, as we've said many times, and often to people's chagrin or shock, that there is no such thing as an abnormal fantasy. Right? Fantasy is fantasy, and we don't necessarily have a lot of choice in the thoughts that pop into our head or the things that may trigger that arousal, that excitement. But
It's a safe place.
where we have choice is whether or not to act
Right.
on an impulse.
Right.
Right. My favorite example when people present with like distressing fantasies and they say, "Can you make me not be into this anymore?" And my usual line is, "I'm still waiting for the therapeutic equivalent of a shovel to the back of the head," but we don't have any way
Right.
of making that, erasing that. It's not like you can go into a hard drive and delete.
Right. Stop thinking about it.
Right. Yeah. Don't think of a pink elephant. But we would work with folks who have distressing fantasies on impulse control and understanding that you can have a thought, an impulse, a desire, and not act on it. So my favorite go-to is your typical postnatal woman who's in maybe some postnatal depression or just the stress of having a newborn. How many millions and millions of women have had the thought, "I'm going to kill this fucking baby if it doesn't stop screaming."
The postpartum
right?
depression and psychosis.
Right. But how many women actually do kill their babies?
Right.
So this extraordinarily common thought or intrusive fantasy or, "Oh my God, I can't believe I just thought that," is worlds apart from taking that step and doing it.
Right. Now, I also want to throw in, because, I can't help but be reminded of a couple that I
think I know
worked
where
with
you're
many,
going.
many years
Yes,
ago.
Yes.
In fact, this was something that was in an article that was probably, I think it was 2016. I contributed to this article and some of the weirdest cases or strangest cases in sex therapy. And I did have that couple. I did have that guy who had the same kind of job as this guy did. He worked nights in a hospital, particularly in the morgue.
The morgue, yeah.
And it was right around the time that Tom Petty's Last Dance with Mary Jane came out. And he really didn't have any trouble, controlling. He did have some thoughts, but when that came out, and now there's something that's visual and there's music and there's feeling that comes associated with it, he really started to feel those intrusive thoughts. But he at least had the wherewithal to say, "You know what? I feel this urge that I want to do this, but I know it's not right and I don't want to do it and I need help."
Right.
And it became a great example, and I'll put this out there in this way for people, that sometimes the best tool that a therapist can have in dealing with sexual problems is an understanding and a willing partner. And in this particular case, it made all the difference in the world. And we're able to turn those necrophilic urges into fantasy play, mutual, consensual fantasy play with his wife. Now, at first, she was a little uncomfortable with that, as I'm sure everybody can imagine.
Every time I think of the story, I think that's love. And
Absolutely.
most people would think, maybe not a match made in heaven, but That's love.
Yeah, I would even take issue with that. I mean,
willingness.
talk about a match that is made in
So what
perfect fit.
What was his wife willing to do?
What
for
she
her
was
husband?
willing when she got over the initial shock and disgust and what's wrong with you, and we talked a little bit about fantasies and just sort of normalizing the world in people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
And she, as a way of helping her husband, was willing to play along. So they had these little play fantasies and it would be the mortician and the corpse, the pretty
right?
corpse. And
so didn't she get into an
she would
ice
sit
bath?
into a bathtub with really cold water before they did it, so her skin was tight and cold. She put on that very kind of goth, pure type of makeup, the white pancake, like the black lipsticks, and she would play the corpse. And it was a mutually enjoyable episode of sex play.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Nobody was hurt. Nobody was violated. No trust was betrayed. It was healthy, maybe unusual, yes.
Right.
But that's not a factor that we should criticize people
And that's
for.
not a marker of a mental illness.
Exactly.
Just because it's outside of the norm, right? Which that word, the clinical term for kink, or what most people refer to as kink, is paraphilia, which if you break down from the Greek, would mean outside love, which doesn't mean doing it outdoors in the backyard, which could be kinky in itself if there's neighbors walking by. But it's just outside of whatever, and this is a big issue in all of sexuality. Who gets to define what the norm is?
That's right.
So it's really just a statistical thing. It's a mathematical. Remember from learning about means and averages and standard deviations. So that
deviation from the norm.
Deviation from the norm. But we use that word deviant like it's, like someone is a monster, some truly abnormal, dangerous threat. Yeah. Same thing, these groups that are sometimes referred to as virtuous pedophiles. Or minor attracted persons,
people.
MAPs, where people, just as you said, the same thing. They realize they have this orientation or sexual impulse, but they know why you're not supposed to act out on a kid. And they might need help. They might need help from someone like us. And so many therapists, if a patient came in and said, I have sexual thoughts about kids, the majority of licensed therapists in this country would think that they have a professional and moral duty to report that this patient is talking about abusing children. And patient never said that.
Right.
The
They never said they
just
did.
Said they have
said they
these
had thoughts.
feelings, right?
Right.
We don't have a thought police yet. It's not like that Minority Report, that Philip K. Dick story, where you had, pre-crimes, where people can see crimes before they happened and then go arrest the person for thinking about committing a crime. No, that's science fiction still.
And let's also blast out of the water the very common myth that if you think about something, if you fantasize something, it means you really want to do it. And if you allow yourself to continue to fantasize about it, it's just a step away of having to do it. And it's just not true.
It just is not true. It's still, public enemy number one. In fact, many states in the country formally declaring public health crisis out of porn.
Right.
And blaming porn for sexual difficulties in relationships.
Right.
And it's a really convenient scapegoat.
It is. It's nice to know that we've got cancer beat.
Yeah.
HIV is gone.
COVID. Right.
What COVID?
Let's worry about
it's porn. That's the real health
public
issue.
health crisis. Yeah, that's what's going to be the end of civilization. It's never about the porn. And yes, it's so common. And I will take the risk and be sexist and say more often than not, it's women who find their husbands or boyfriends masturbating and immediately think, well, if that's what you're looking at, that's what you're into, and I can't compete with that because that's some two-dimensional, huge-breasted thing that doesn't even probably exist in the real world. And how can I compete with that? So I'm not good enough for you.
Right.
And these couples need to really hear loud and clear that it's never about the porn, and that fantasy, just like you said, doesn't mean anything other than it's just a fantasy.
Right. And it's, this is not competition. It's not something you have to live up to.
Right.
And, also another thing too, at the risk of bringing the ire of people on here, when you decide to be with somebody, you make a commitment to them. Let's say you get married. You don't own their genitals.
That's right.
You don't own their pleasure. It doesn't now belong to you.
And people who are in relationships do not give up their right to have a private fantasy life. Right?
Exactly.
A lot of these couples retreats and workshops, very often they're kind of religious or church-based. And typically the first activity to start the weekend is everybody gets a pad and pen, and they're told to write down every fantasy they've ever had to share with their partner, because secrets are toxic. What a horrible idea.
It's
horrible
truly
idea.
awful.
If I have a fantasy that I know would anger or disgust my partner, what possible good would there be from sharing it?
None.
And can I have a thought that's my own?
Right.
Just because I...
And what if it's not a horrible fantasy that will anger my partner? What if it's just my fantasy and I don't want to share it? I'm just not comfortable.
There you go. Right.
It doesn't have to be problematic. All right.
Yeah.
So I think we've gotten you off the hook from the necrophile. Right?
Good.
So I think we got to relieve that. But actually, I want to come back to it just to put a fine point on this.
Put it back on the hook.
Okay. Now I just want to put a fine point on this, because when that woman, right, that second part of that story, found out that this guy was arrested, she went to the jail,
but the wrong
with
one.
the express purpose. She brought a knife in, the express purpose of killing him. When she went in there, she apparently had a freak out. I want this guy.
Well, she went to the wrong jail.
And she found she went to the wrong jail.
That he wasn't there. But according to the report, it took 8 or 9 police officers to subdue her and handcuff her.
Right.
And she was quoted in the article as saying, I am 100% sure that if he was in that jail, I would have shoved this knife through his heart because he did that to me.
Right. And she was arrested.
We don't know.
But we do.
The outcome.
No charges were brought.
Oh.
She was let go.
You followed up.
I did.
You're a reporter now. That's awesome.
So
I'm glad she was let off,
yeah.
because you know what? I think I would have done the same thing.
Yeah,
or at least have
that's
had the
understandable.
feeling,
Yes.
the desire to.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Now, if she actually stabbed him, probably not. But, the fact that it became this little sort of mistake upon mistake, so, so there was kind of a happy ending to that.
And our final news item tonight is about the number of corporations that are funding Republican politicians, particularly those supporting Ohio's proposed abortion ban, which, as we said earlier, is even more strict than the one in Texas. Right.
Now, let me just a little background in there. You may recall that part of the Texas abortion ban is they are banning abortion after 6 weeks.
Right.
The difference in Ohio is that they don't have any time limit on it. If a woman is pregnant, the moment she is pregnant, regardless of whether she knows it or not, there's no leeway for her to terminate that pregnancy.
And the same as Texas with this vigilantism. And I can't possibly imagine how this would pass judicial review. But like Texas, they're saying we're passing this law and we're not going to enforce it. We're going to leave it to the good citizens of our state.
Right.
So that a total stranger can sue a woman who he or she thinks may have had an abortion. Could have been a miscarriage, but it doesn't seem to matter to these politicians.
No, they really don't care, because they just really don't like women.
Yeah. Well, and to quote Stephen Colbert last week, all of these Republican politicians who are voting against universal pre-K, He said they're only concerned with pre-K,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Once they're born, they don't give a shit anymore.
Exactly. And there's some major corporations that are funding these things. They're funding this legislation in Ohio, just like they're funding it in Texas. One of the biggest funders of Texas, and I believe Ohio as well, AT&T, right, that are putting hundreds of thousands of dollars into this, not just anti-abortion legislation, but this vigilante, this, I would call it criminal legislation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's truly awful. So all of you who have AT&T, I hope you enjoy both bad service and really horrible funding priorities.
Yeah. So this piece from Huffington Post points out that there were 24 Ohio lawmakers who, according to a report from an organization called Ultraviolet, a national gender justice organization, identified 38 companies that gave more than $102,000.
$132,000.
Right. To these Ohio lawmakers backing this anti-abortion bill. And when you first showed me the piece, I thought, $132,000 total, 38 companies? That doesn't seem like, that seems like pocket change to these giant corporations. But
they were local. These were state. These were not federal elections.
As they point out in the article, $5,000 in a state election buys a lot of lawn signs, which is often the one deciding factor of who wins, who has the most lawn signs. So we're talking about companies, even though these might seem like small donations, the list of these 38 companies includes Pfizer and other big pharma companies like Merck and Anthem, Molina Healthcare, Charter Communications, Dominion Energy, and even General Motors. So, it's like the old radical advocacy days of boycotting companies because of their politics has become pretty difficult in this day and age when we're talking about huge cannibalistic corporations that own thousands of companies. And, how do you not do business with AT&T in one form or another, or Big Pharma, or, buying cars, right? So it's not easy to use one's dollar to make a political statement, as maybe it was in previous generations. But it is something to keep in mind, that corporations are directly, here's a quote from the HuffPost piece, corporations are directly funding the erosion of our rights.
Indeed.
With their political dollars.
And let me also point this out as well, because remember when, I think it was Georgia, when they started passing some of their laws, especially anti-trans laws, and a lot of those states that do, again, there were people calling for the boycotting. And what did we hear from a lot of these other people, a lot of these other corporations even, saying, it's not your place. It's not a corporation's place to get into politics. You got to keep that out of it. Just because you have that platform, you don't have to use it. Celebrities need to shut up and stay in their lane and all that nonsense. Yet these turn out to be the same people who are funding these political things, these anti-abortion, these draconian, medieval, because they're now, some of these also talk about criminalizing abortion, both for the woman who has it and for the doctor who performs it. And then you get that vigilante piece. So where's the corporations need to shut up when it comes to funding these kinds of things?
Yeah.
Right? So the hypocrisy just abounds. And as we do like to end this, one of our favorite pieces, we like to call out hypocrisy, especially around sex and sexuality. We want to call out ne'er-do-wells, especially that pretend to do well around sex and sexuality issues. And what do we call this segment?
Poetic Justice.
Indeed.
Right.
And who do we have for this week's Poetic Justice?
Well, we thought we'd go just with the last piece we were talking about these corporations funding anti-abortion legislation in Ohio, and want to call out in particular Pfizer, Big Pharma, for no other reason than they are the makers of Viagra, right? So we, following that logic, we want more men to have more erections, to make more babies, but we want to make it more and more difficult for women to do anything about any of these babies that are unwanted.
That's right.
Because no man need be denied his God-given right to erections on demand, but women's bodies don't belong to them.
No. And let's add in that God-given right to impregnate any woman that they want.
Well,
Right? Because it's still a responsibility that we put squarely on the proverbial shoulders of women. Right? And even though this is how I started over 30 years ago, I was hired as the first male sexuality educator. I was with Planned Parenthood, and the whole point was to get this male responsibility initiative.
Right.
And here we are, 30 something years later, and we're still dealing with the same things.
yeah. And this attitude that if you don't want to get pregnant, I suggest you do something to prevent it because I'm just here for the fun part, and that's not my job. No, birth control is everyone's job.
Right. So if any company should be promoting sexual health, sexual choice,
And giving their money to these causes.
Right. It should be Pfizer.
Right.
It should be the makers of Viagra. But they chose to go the other way. So because of what we consider to be great hypocrisy, right, we would like to honor Pfizer as this week's Poetic Justice.
With our usual salute, the Bronx jeer.
Indeed.
That'll do it. See you next Sunday for more Sex in the News. We are the Siegel Brothers.
Stay well.